Hey everyone, Kyron here from No BS Crypto, bringing you a brand new interview. Today, I have the absolute pleasure of talking with Derek Yoo. Now, Derek is the founder of Moonbeam and Moonriver, both Polkadot and Kusama respective projects. They are making absolute strides right now in the ecosystem, and they're without a doubt going to be one of the top players in the Polkadot, Kusama, and also, I believe, the global ecosystem moving forward. Now, Derek is a well-respected guy. I highly respect him myself. And I think you guys are going to be able to have a really, really good perspective into Derek's mind in this interview and also have hopefully some of your questions answered. So without further ado, let's get into the video. Alrighty, guys, welcome to the video. Derek, thank you so much for joining me today. It's an absolute pleasure to meet you, and I'm excited for the discussion ahead.
Yeah, really great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. I think let's just kick things off with a bit of an introduction on who you are and a bit of history as to kind of how you got into cryptocurrency, into the space. So maybe if you could touch on life before crypto and kind of what the reasons were that led you into the space to begin with.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Derek Yoo. I'm the CEO currently of Purestake. My history, I have been working in software, kind of building software in different contexts for a long time now. So that started actually all the way back. I'll date myself here with like the first internet wave. So in like the late 90s. So that's when I started, and so I've seen a bunch of different, let's call it like revolutions, kind of technical revolutions. And actually, that's one of the reasons I'm so interested in crypto, right? Because I think there are a lot of similarities between like that first internet wave and Web3. I think though, like when I first got out of college, though, you could see like this internet thing happening, and you knew it was going to change everything. But at that time, I was just like too young and inexperienced to do much with it, right? Other than watch it kind of happen in front of my eyes. And so I think that when I started learning about Web3 later. It was kind of like a second chance. It's like, okay, now I can be at the beginning of something that I know is going to change the way everything works. But yeah, in the interim, I worked on software, number of different environments. The big thing I did was I started a company called Fuse back in 2006 with another guy, Steve Kokinos. And I was there for a long time. We built that basically a traditional Web 2 SaaS company, right? So I was there for a long time, I think about 13, 14 years. That company at its height was about a 700 person company. So, learned a lot in that process because it started with two of us, in a garage, and it was all kinds of chapters of that story. So that was like, going out, getting VC funding, bootstrapping a product, a cloud service, building out a sales force, all these different like stages of growth of that company. So learned a bunch. Two things happened though. I think I learned something about myself in that process, and I like earlier stage companies like better than like later stage ones. There's different people that are better at different things, and I think I'm definitely better at this like earlier stage. The second thing is that co-founder that I started the company with, Steve, he left to start a crypto project. So I knew nothing about Web3 or crypto at that time, and so he left to start a crypto project. He became the one of the founders and CEO of Algorand, which is another layer one blockchain based in Boston here, like I am. And so when this guy who I'd worked with for so many years left to do that, he's still quite a good friend of mine. That got me quite interested, right? And I said, well, what is this thing that he's gone to do? It sounds pretty strange and different, and I think that was my ticket down the rabbit hole. And as I learned more, I got increasingly interested, and then I realized, like, look, I have to find a way to get into the space myself. And so that's what led to starting Purestake, which was and continues to be focused on providing, let's call it like infrastructure and protocol development services, for Web3 projects. And a ton of learning since the beginning of 2019 when I came into the space. Every day is kind of learning. I say in the space, everything is changing, but I love it, right? So like I can't see myself like going back to Web 2. Like this is like this is my home here for the rest of my career. That's for sure.
It definitely moves quickly. Like that's, I think, the main difference there. It's like things happen so fast. It's like innovation is always happening, and it's exciting. That's what kind of gets me so interested as well. We ever kind of a bit concerned about sort of starting a business in the industry, like hearing possibly a bit of FUD, I guess you could say, prior to actually entering crypto?
I think not really in a sense, but I think that, I had this like entrepreneurial experience before. So I think that the first time you go and start something, it is a bit of a scary thing.
Yeah.
The second time you start something, I think it's less scary, right? Because you've kind of been through it once before, that like, kind of like what's the worst that can happen kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um, and, I'd say that like, I think a lot of entrepreneurs are the same where like, you can't think too much about all the failure modes and other things, then you'll never like get anything off the ground, right? So you have to kind of, there is a little bit of like putting blinders on and just kind of like marching ahead, like when you're starting something, because if you thought about all the different challenges and problems that like could befall you, then yeah, that's like I said, there would never be any startups anywhere. Like so.
That's right. Yeah, someone's got to take the jump at some point. Yeah. Um, what I guess so. I, I kind of like to ask prominent people in the space kind of what their advice could be to someone that's wanting to become someone in sort of the same position, leadership, or has a great idea and wants to kind of bring it to fruition. Do you have any sort of like tips or something you would like to tell maybe a future version, not a future version of yourself, a younger version of yourself before you got into this sort of thing? Someone growing in the space.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's still just like there's so much opportunity in the Web3 space because everything is so new. There's just so many different like areas to tackle. There's so many different things that need to be built. So I think that sure we're bear market now, like by all accounts, but I mean I still just see opportunities everywhere, and and I think it's because things are like early and still like less mature. That's what creates all these opportunities, and so I'd
Yeah.
say that the key thing for me even this for my Web 2 experience is you need to be close to the problem basically, right? So like you want to like be in an environment where you're seeing people trying to do something and like having a hard time. Like that's the key for me is like if you hear people complaining about something, hear people kind of sighing and be like, oh, if only this were easier, that's like gold, right? Like listen carefully to those things. If you see a lot of people kind of with that like feeling or attitude, well, that's probably a good place to start a product. And so I think that was I mean, you have to have some vision. So if I think of Moonbeam, right? I mean, definitely there was a bet on like a multi-chain kind of future like built into like Moonbeam and like a bet on the EVM, and there's a bet on the several things, which we could maybe get into later. There was definitely motivations for those things, but like a lot of like what how it evolved was based on like this like listening to like customers really. I use this word customers, which tends to freak like Web3 people out sometimes. It's like, well, customers, that's not who I'm dealing with. But I think it's a healthy way to think about things is, you need to like listen carefully to who it is, whoever it is that the user of your thing is, and react. And like when they're complaining, those are like rough edges that need to be polished down. And sometimes it sounds basic, but sometimes these things just don't happen in Web3. So I think that if you do that, you can have a competitive product, right? And I think that's why I think we get good feedback on Moonbeam because like we've listened to a lot of that feedback and it runs smoothly, it works well. It like it kind of a lot of those rough edges have been filed down.
Excellent. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Is Purestake focused in other avenues other than Moonbeam and Moonriver?
Yeah, and so I should explain a little bit. So there is a thing where Purestake, we're providing protocol development services, but kind of the stewards of the network. There is a foundation. So there's the Moonbeam Foundation, which is kind of the let's call it like the stewards of the network. They're the ones who issue grants. They're the ones who, are kind of. Like over they have kind of like some governance kind of responsibilities like around the network, and so yeah, that's a split of responsibility that way where we're kind of providing the technical services. Now we did start off like on the infrastructure side, like running like nodes and like other like RPC and like other kinds of infrastructure. That actually helped us quite a bit like moving into Moonbeam, because then we understood what that infrastructure needed to look like to be secure and reliable and to be something that developers could could rely on. We started off like as I was saying, my co-founder had worked to start like Algorand's. We were involved in the launch of that network. We are quite familiar with that network. But I think what the vision that kind of led to Moonbeam was this idea that there's going to be many chains, and that the connectivity or the way these chains would talk to each other, that was going to be a critical capability. And so that's, I think it was that idea that I kind of felt, hey, like this is definitely going to be true, and like so there's like a room for like a new thing here. Yeah. And so with Purestake, I mean, sure, I think that and as with anything, now that work has been done on Moonbeam as a protocol, again, there's like people trying to do things, and then maybe they're having a hard time, so then that leads to new ideas about, oh, hey, well, maybe there's like a new capability or protocol that could do this instead. Yeah. That would help like file down those rough edges, basically. So I think I've been actually like thinking a lot about some of these different ideas these days. In the spirit of kind of building the bear kind of thing.
Yeah. I guess as someone who's like creative, you're trying to think of, as you said, new ideas is going to solve an issue, and obviously, listening to the community, you're going to be able to come up with some pretty good ideas. And I think that was one of my next questions was like, are you thinking from a pure stake perspective on developing new protocols? But you pretty much answered that, haven't you? You are thinking of different things, different solutions to more problems.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's like I get satisfaction from building a product that like people use, right? So like
Yeah.
it's like like the thing that like I feel like I know something about is like developer infrastructure. In particular now, so like Web3 kind of decentralized like developer infrastructure. And I'll tell you that right now we're just in like the early like innings of this, right? So if you look at like mature technologies like in the Web2 space, you've got AWS, you kind of log in, there's like this whole fleet of different services, you click around a few times, you have these very powerful kind of dynamic services spin up. That is not what Web3 development is like these days. It's much more, it's like, rewind like 20 years or something like of what things used to be like. And so I think that things will evolve in the same way so that ultimately there will be something AWS like that'll be as easy as that, as powerful as that for a developer to access these services. But I can tell you that there's a lot of development work needed from where we are now to get to like that ease of use. But as that happens, it'll be increasingly easy for people to develop decentralized apps versus today's like centralized like applications.
Yeah, for sure. There's a long way to go. I think people sometimes, including myself, I mean, I tend to forget how early we really are. When you kind of immerse yourself in this world, it's easy to think that everyone already knows about it. And it's kind of, this is kind of the fine tuning it to get to the best point is very minimal, when in reality, there's a lot to still go. Let's talk a bit about Moonbeam now. If you're going to describe Moonbeam in 2 sentences, very briefly, to someone who's never heard of the protocol before, I know it might be a bit difficult, but what would you kind of say in that regard?
Yeah, I'd call it like it's a smart contract platform that specializes in cross-chain use cases. Being good at supporting cross-chain use cases. Probably the follow-on sentence would be that like it's like it implements EVMs as an EVM compatible chain.
Yeah.
But it has unique kind of extensions or kind of additions to support cross-chain, as well as it has like a very like kind of complete like on-chain governance system, which is quite a bit different than compared to like Ethereum mainnet, for example. So those are some of the key differences. And I mentioned before this EVM thing. I mean, this is kind of something that I know people have opinions on, like it's great or it sucks, but I think this is where some of my Web2 experience, I think, is what kind of help me decide or help decide what direction to go there, where it's just a numbers thing where you have a tech stack. EVM is by far the most like adopted one. It has like the most tools for it. It has the most like infrastructure integrations that are possible with it. So just it's the path of least resistance in like among like many different dimensions. And so that's where it was quite clear, hey, we want to make this developer infrastructure, like what kind of approach should be used. EVM was kind of the obvious like choice there. And you can see that that's helped Moonbeam quite a bit in the sense that it has a ton of integrations on it because it's easy. And I think in this, for developers, for like people doing integrations, easy like always wins, right? If you have like easy and it's like secure and reliable, then like that's kind of going to happen by default.
Yeah, I think, and I mean, Ethereum's only going to get more. I believe it's just going to get more and more used, I guess you could say, because it's moving into the ETH 2.0 sharding sort of thing. And once that's fully implemented, I mean, I think a bridge between that and Polkadot's always going to be required. I mean, Polkadot's extremely undervalued in my opinion, just because it hasn't had its kind of day in the sun yet, really. Because parachains have just recently kind of come to fruition, and that was kind of the tail end of the last bull market. So I think there's lots of value to still be had there. But that kind of leads me into my next question as well. Like, what was the reason that you actually chose to actually go as a parachain onto Polkadot? Was there ever a thought that maybe we should create our own network specifically for? I'm talking Moonbeam here, but obviously this also applies to Moonriver.
Yeah, I think that a couple things, right? So like one is, if your use case requires like the development of its own chain, as Moonbeam did, then the question is, there's a landscape of different choices you have for how to implement that chain. And for me, it kind of boils down to like just 2 choices at this point, right? So either you would use Substrate, which is the technology we chose, the Rust-based like blockchain building framework that's made by Parity, or you'd use the Cosmos SDK, a Golang based environment that one uses to build chains in the Cosmos ecosystem. And so we looked at both of those. We had like some preferences, like for Rust as like a programming language. It's a bit lower level, it's more performant, and among other reasons, we had a preference for Substrate. So that's the path we went down. I would say the second reason is around this like cross-chain idea. And so this cross-chain like messaging capability, I think of it as like networking, right? So you have these things that are these community computers. They've been like isolated up until now, and now you're starting to have them like be networked for the first time. Which, just like when computers were networked, that's going to lead to like all sorts of interesting different like new use cases, things like the internet, like open like a lot of possibilities. But to have this like messaging capability built in and part of the security model of the chain, I think is quite interesting and like an important capability. And so the only way we could access that on Polkadot was to be a parachain, is to have this like secure XCM messaging capability. And a lot of times people will compare Cosmos and Polkadot, so that's definitely a comparison point. I think that the architecture of Polkadot is more that it's like one system. It's one system with these different shards, whereas in Cosmos, it's a little bit more like a bunch of standalone chains that optionally have this way to like kind of pass messages between each other. And my view was that this like single system approach, would lead to like a richer set of like interactions ultimately. Because I'll give you a simple example. On Polkadot, everyone's forced to be at the same version. So like it's a pain in the ass on the one hand, because that means when the relay chain's upgrading, then we all have to upgrade. And like so, but at the same time, that means that there's this like uniform playing field where we can now exchange messages with anyone on there without like needing to worry about versions or setting up additional infrastructure or doing other things. And so I think to me that was like, I was like, okay, that seems right to me, to kind of have this little bit more of a structured approach where we can have guarantees about like remote interactions with other chains.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't actually know. So Cosmos actually implements a form of XCM.
So they have their own system called IBC. But I think, it's like this architectural vision is different, right? Where it's like, okay, everyone's their own chain, and optionally we'll have these kind of like trade agreements, let's call them, or like, we can open these channels to send IBC messages. And so don't get me wrong, it's a very good system, but I think it's like the analogy I use is like Polkadot feels, and I'm an American, so Polkadot feels more like it's a more federal system where it's like you have different states, but they're all part of the same United States, let's say. Whereas Cosmos feels more European to me, where it's like you have these different countries, they're all different, they speak different languages and whatnot, and then maybe there's some trade agreements between them, but it's more this like patchwork of different like countries. Now, I think the interesting thing is like on the Cosmos side, like they are working on like a shared security model. So one of the key features you can give when you're kind of all part of the same system is the shared security concept, which we're leveraging as part of the Moonbeam implementation. And Cosmos is moving in the same direction, where they are, there's different competing ideas on how to do it. But, the Cosmos hub, for example, might be a place where, chains could attach to it, kind of rent security from the validators on the Cosmos hub.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. I've never really looked into Cosmos before, so it might be an avenue to take. But so let's just move back to Moonbeam specifically now. Is it true that you've kind of had this vision, and I know you're an innovator, so it makes sense, but like had the vision of just simply the bridge between Ethereum and Polkadot, and kind of as XCM's developed, it's you've developed the general message passing sort of option as well. Was that always a foresight going into Polkadot? It's like, okay, well, they're developing this, we're going to obviously work towards this in the future, or was it kind of like, okay, well, this is awesome, let's utilize it?
I would say that some things I kind of had some ideas or potential foresight into, but a bunch of things not. And so again, I would go back to what was clear was that, okay, you have this sharded system, all these shards can talk to each other, but it was clear to me that like having an EVM shard was correct and obvious, right? Given this, thing we talked about before, where it's the thing that, has the least friction for integrations. It has all these tools. It's going to be the easiest place to deploy, like, dApps or smart contracts. And so that was kind of clear. Like, look, there's this new like ecosystem. I'm a long-term believer in it and its underlying technology. There's going to be an EVM shard. And so, that seems obvious now, but I guess back at, the end of 2019, this is, you got to understand, this is before like BNB chain. This is before, Aurora. This is before any of these other things happened. So that was a little bit of bet. I had people at the time tell me like, this, you're crazy. Basically, there's only like Ethereum, and there's not going to be any other EVMs. Before Avalanche launched too, right? And so I think that, well, I like to think that idea like played out, right? So like it's correct that there's correctness in this, like every like ecosystem, is going to have an EVM on it just because this dominant tech stack. And then, that's going to be a natural integration point, not only for developers to deploy things, but for it's like these integrations, right? So it's like any bridges, like any like custodians, like any wallets. Like I feel like this is the key thing, and we see it playing on Polkadot, where I think Moonbeam has become a center of activity just because of that, right? Because it's so easy to have all these integrations. Now, I would say that this cross-chain vision that has evolved a bunch since the end of 2019 when like things kicked off. So there, at that time, there was just two. There was just like Cosmos and Polkadot, and they were the only two people out there talking about cross-chain, anything other than bridging, basically. Now the landscape has changed a lot, right? So now you have all these GMP protocols, general message passing, which are protocols that are designed to relay messages from like one chain to another, even if they're not part of the same system. And so there are different security assumptions there. Like for example, on Moonbeam, there's a good at least 4 or more that are getting traction. So that's Accelerator, Wormhole, Layer 0, Hyperlane, like those 4. We did a hackathon with those 4 even, right? And so then combined with XCM. And so I think that's, a lot of those, most of those launched last year. So this is all new capabilities where like people are understanding, hey, there's all these chains and now they need to be networked with each other. They need to be able to communicate. And what we see is like we're specializing this. So there's development teams on Moonbeam that are creating these new multi-chain architectures, like pretty interesting stuff, right? Hub and spoke is one of the architectures we see a lot of. And those protocols are just launching like in the first half. The first wave of those is launching the first half this year. And so I think that's going to be like really, really cool. A lot of these apps, they have a user experience that abstracts the chains away. So you have like one user experience, but you might be interacting with a bunch of chains behind the scenes. And, it affords these like scenarios that are like more efficient. So like, for DeFi protocols, for example, there's a bunch of lending protocols where they're saying, hey, like you can like deposit on one chain, but then like go like use that leverage that deposit on some other chain. And so that's stuff that, is uniquely enabled by these like cross-chain scenarios. But yeah, so some of these things I definitely couldn't foresee. Like one of the other scenarios just came up earlier today is, there's a lot of scenarios now that are spanning multiple messaging systems. So you might have like assets coming in via like Wormhole, let's say, like onto Moonbeam, ETH, DAI, like it could be something like this, like an asset coming in. But then like there's teams that want those assets that are in Polkadot. So then Moonbeam acts as kind of like a router where it might then get routed onwards via XCM to like get to its final destination, like somewhere else. And so I think this is the kind of stuff that, we're just at the very beginning of like, different like flows of messages. And there's going to be certain places where there are going to be like concentration points or hubs of like messaging activity. I think Moonbeam, that would be great if Moonbeam is one of those. That's kind of one of the goals here.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of activity already on Moonbeam. A friend of mine was actually sending me some health infographics a few days ago, and it's just like, wow, like the ecosystem is starting to flourish and rapidly too. So it's really great to see. I think speaking of XLR and Layer 0, Wormhole, things like that, these GMP protocols, could you maybe just mention how they're leveraged? Because I know that a lot of them sort of connect to the same chains. Is that like sort of like a user can actually pick and choose which GMP protocol they'd like to use over another, or is that kind of routed automatically through the connected contracts?
Yeah, so I'd say that many of them also have bridges associated with them. So that's kind of like a use case they might implement themselves. But I think the more interesting thing is when developers use these GMP protocols as kind of this like networking glue that's like tying smart contracts of theirs together, like from one chain to another. And so I mentioned this hub and spoke thing. So let me explain what a common pattern is. A common pattern that we're seeing is that people might say, okay, my contracts on Moonbeam are the hub. So they're like the brain of the system. They're like, let's call it almost a central database. But then I'll have a whole bunch of spokes. So I might have a remote contract on Avalanche. I might have one on Polygon. I might have one on ETH mainnet. And then so the model is that like, I think of it, then the analogy I use is this, that maybe the hub or the brain, that's kind of like the HQ. Like that's like the main office location. But then you have branch offices, so like a bank, right? So like in your town, you might have the local branch office. And geez, it makes sense to go there. Like I can go there to like, serve, get access to services. But really behind the scenes, that might be routing back to like an HQ somewhere else, right? Where like, all these branches are connected to. And so that's the concept is like meet the users where they are. So you can like, service users like, on Avalanche, like from the contract there. But there's like a flow of information back to this like hub where, you can kind of have this cross-chain visibility. So you have visibility across what's happening across all the branches. And so that's what's then power scenarios like, deposit like on Avalanche and go mint stable coins on mainnet, for example, right? You could do something like that. And I'm a big believer this architecture and these kind of networked architectures are going to be highly competitive to alternatives, because the alternative these days is I'd call it these isolated deployments, right? So you might have a lending protocol like Aave or something. It's deployed on mainnet, it's separately deployed on Avalanche, but you have these kind of island deployments. Whereas with this new technique, everything's connected to each other, right? So you can, any one branch can leverage all the stuff that's everywhere else. So I think that's a big advantage.
Yeah, and as you said, you can pretty much enact a governance proposal from a different chain. You can do everything pretty much from one specific area rather than having to always worry about bridging everything. So as you say, connected. So that's it blew my mind when I was looking into Moonbeam back in my review. Yeah, and it's just amazing where the technology is really going with, especially with in regards to GMP, XCMP. So message passing is amazing. What about connected contracts, Derek? What or the dApps sort of that can be built on Moonbeam, leveraging your substrate palettes and also the Ethereum developer tools? Can you kind of touch on maybe some of the really cool use cases that can be created from this?
Yeah, so I think like I said, a lot of them are in this DeFi sector, where people are figuring. I think it all it takes is to take an existing idea that was single chain and then expand it out via connected contracts to be multi-chain, where it's natively living on multiple chains. So I think there's a number of teams that are doing that. I see a particular concentration in the lending and borrowing sector there. So that's definitely one. There's multiple great protocol teams that are coming live with new unique offerings in that area. But there are also other interesting areas. So for example, there's another project team that has a game on Moonbeam. So it's called Exiled Racers. The game is a racing game. So it's an NFT based, you have NFT based ships, pilots, different equipment you can equip on your ship, and then you race against other people. Now, the interesting thing is, okay, it's on Moonbeam, but using this connected contract strategy, they are also able to have racetracks on other chains. So the idea again is to meet the user. So there's some set of, there's a great community and users around Moonbeam, but let's say that you have a racetrack on Avalanche, then you can engage with users on Avalanche, and they can transfer their ships over there, or they can purchase ships there and then race there. But it's all part of one system. So then the race results are kind of aggregating back. So you have some concept of, hey, here's how well I did across any of the racetracks on any of the different chains, in terms of performance. And so I think, that's a, different kind of use case, but the same idea where you kind of what chain you're on matters less. And I think for a developer, the key thing, that we heard is, when you're a development team, it's a hard choice up front to choose what chain to go on, right? Because you're geez, if I get it wrong, oh, then I might have to restart and go somewhere else. And are there enough users? And there's all these questions. Do I want to be a big fish in a little pond, a little fish in a big pond? What's my strategy? I think that's going to go away over time, where using this kind of approach, you can say, well, geez, let me start on Moonbeam, but my market isn't confined to just Moonbeam users. I can then expand out to other destinations, and it's just like a regular business, right? And I'd start in one city and then I expand out to other cities, to get at new users as my business grows. And so I think that's very attractive for developers, right? To be able to take this kind of incremental approach and know that they're not kind of constrained or limited into one market.
And that's been this problem for the longest amount of time, hasn't it? It's where it's kind of your native, whatever you build on, you're stuck there. And if you want to branch out, you do. It's you're pretty much fragmenting everything about the business to where it's not even really worth it at that point, is it? So it's I think that's a part of that's why I like to promote Moonbeam in such a great light, is because I can see what's actually going to come from this, what still is to come, and what's kind of coming to fruition now. And I think, as I mentioned before, all those infographics and all the stats don't lie. People are recognizing this, and so yeah, it's just amazing to see, really. What about
there was a pretty cool Electric Capital report that dropped just even a couple of days ago. I don't know if you saw that, but I think there were some pretty good numbers for Moonbeam in there.
What I might do is I'll put some on the screen now so everyone can know what we're talking about, just so we're on the same playing field. But yeah, it really is just starting to grow. And I think more than what most people thought, especially in a bear market, and compared to some other chains as well, some big layer ones. What about XC20 tokens, Derek? Could you maybe touch on those and what their role is in the ecosystem?
Yeah, so I think that as XCM as a cross-chain technology first launched last year, the most obvious and lowest hanging fruit use case was around token transfers. And so we did some work around the standard XC20. The idea was, we have this great secure messaging system within Polkadot Let's use it to power token transfers. But on top of that, let's like add compatibility for Moonbeam and its EVM. And so the idea is that if you're on any other parachain on the system or the relay chain, you can transfer assets via XCM, which is Polkadot's secure messaging system, to Moonbeam. When they're on Moonbeam, they live as an XC20. What that means is they can be accessed from the Moonbeam EVM as if they're an ERC20. So you can take DOT from the relay chain, it can move onto Moonbeam, and then it's basically it looks and feels and acts as if it's an ERC20. And this was a big kind of selling point for a lot of development teams who said, look, DOT's like a top 10 asset. I want to be able to service it. What's the easiest way to do that? Well, a lot of these teams were coming from other EVM chains, and so then it's okay, let's deploy on Moonbeam and let's be able to service DOT as an XC20 in our protocol without even making any changes, right? It's compatible with everything we already have. And so a whole bunch of teams have done that. For example, there's a Curve pool that has a lot of this DOT against the Lido staking derivative version of DOT. Lido itself, it built a DOT liquid a liquid staking version of DOT that's deployed to Moonbeam. And so I think, again, it's kind of this just solving this practical problem for developers that wanted to be able to access assets. And I think a lot of other teams now have created these XC20 versions of their assets. They move them to Moonbeam, where they can access DeFi venues and other kinds of services that are deployed there.
Yeah, awesome. And what about the Accelerator Program? Could you maybe touch on that there? I think some people might not know what that actually is. And yeah.
Yeah, I think that we do have the Moonbeam Foundation is sponsoring a new accelerator. And let me back up and explain a little bit about kind of how a little bit of the history here. So I mean, Moonbeam is like a community chain, right? So this is not like a huge amounts of VC money and all this kind of thing. It's a community chain that's been bootstrapped. And so a lot of the teams, there's many of them. So if you go to downtown Moonbeam, you can see there's 250, 300 different teams have deployed to Moonbeam. But they tend to be small. So a lot of the teams are relatively small. It's usually a technically led team. And so I think the first thing that the Moonbeam Foundation realized is hey, we need to be able to give grants out to these teams to help them bootstrap themselves. And so there's been a very healthy grants program that's existed for some time to help teams get the resources they need to be able to create their protocols and deploy. I think the second move that last year Moonbeam Foundation did was around an ecosystem fund. So in partnership with the folks over at Arrington, the idea was, hey, for great teams, if they need the capital to be able to grow, maybe even move multi-chain like I was describing and develop their protocol, having a fund that's focused just on Moonbeam ecosystem, that's a very good thing. So that was done last year. And so I think the realization now is that, hey, so you have grants on the one side, so you have this way to bootstrap people from scratch. A lot of people are coming from hackathons and other things and being okay, yeah, great, let's build this, this first prototype or this thing. You have on the other side, you have this this VC, basically this ecosystem fund that can help fund things. I think what we realize is there's kind of a gap in the middle. So the gap in the middle is yeah, you might have a prototype, but a lot of these teams, again, they may not be at the point where they're ready to pitch a VC. And if you've never been in that situation, there's a lot of, you have to have very clear ideas about go to market and marketing and other things. And so I think the realization was, hey, there's something missing in the middle, and that's what the accelerator is filling. So there's the first cohort is still accepting applications actually now, and with a cutoff in a bit. And the idea is that it's a pretty selective process where out of all the applicants, 10 will be selected, but for those 10, they'll be put through this very intensive kind of boot camp kind of process where they'll learn all sorts of things about not only technology but marketing, go to market, digital marketing, SEO, how to put together and manage waiting lists for an unlaunched product. And so I think the idea is that going through that program and then getting to the end of it, then you'll be in great shape to get VC funding. And the feedback we've gotten from teams is that hey, this would be super useful, right? Especially teams that the teams we tend to be led by an actual engineer, let's say, or a developer, and they may have less experience, especially on the business side of things, right? Of how to bootstrap or scale a protocol or a project.
Yeah, so you're filling the gap there where it's okay, if you do have a heavy developer-centric team that hasn't really delved in this and it's it's very, very foreign, you're giving them all the support they need to actually take that next step. And you're right, that I can definitely see there's a huge issue there with that sort of thing. There's a huge middle ground. I mean, I haven't definitely started a business myself, but I've delved into a few. Like I was going to do a Bitcoin mining farm there for a bit, and there is definitely a gap where it's like, okay, here's my concepts, and it's like, okay, now pitching to VC is like something completely, the big jump there. So for sure, I'll leave the link down to that in the description, of course. One final thing, Derek, I wanted to mention was where you would like to see Moonbeam, and we'll also include Moonriver in the next 10, maybe even 20 years. As you say, there's a lot of development to still come.
Mhm.
Do you see those projects sort of growing and growing?
10 or 20 years is a long time in Web3, but yeah,
Yeah.
I like the scope. So I think, I mean, here's my thing is that, you work on a project such as this. By the way, it is like probably the most important and coolest thing I've ever worked on in my life. But it is definitely something that's much bigger than, the team or anything. It's like, even from launch, it's like, these decentralized networks, you realize that they just have all these different stakeholders. Like we have this, like, there's a huge community around the thing now, not just like these, this ambassadors, like very active ambassador community have, but all the node runners, like all of these like project teams are deployed. And so I see it right now as something that like will far outlast like even myself or like anyone on like the Purestake team. There's like it's kind of self-sustaining at this point, right? So there's an on-chain system for issuing grants. So like even if we were to go away, you would just like your grants would be given to someone else to like maintain like to maintain like the protocol itself. So that's like the really cool thing about these systems is that they take on a life of their own and they go in directions that you couldn't have imagined. And so I think that's kind of part of why I love being in the space and will continue to be in it.
Excellent. I've got a couple of community questions for you now, Derek. We'll finish up with these ones. The first one's from a gentleman named Reef. So he's asking, how will Moonriver perform against Moonbeam, and what's its real purpose now that Moonbeam is released?
Yeah. So there's been a lot of different like ideas from the community. Different like people have different narratives around this. So a couple things I would say like right up front that like I feel like I always have to correct people. So one is this idea that it was some sort of temporary thing that then goes away once Moonbeam is released. That is not the case. Like they're like both Moonriver and Moonbeam are like there's a long-term commitment to like both of those networks. They're both as I was just saying, they're both like self-sustaining in a way. And so there's definitely no idea that like Moonriver like goes away now that Moonbeam exists. Second point, the inspiration for Moonriver did come directly from Kusama relative to like Polkadot, right? So, and this is like, and the concept came from Gav himself, like, so Gav Wood, that is. And so the idea is that, that when you have a network like Polkadot, there's certain things that you just like don't know until you deploy there, right? You don't know how things are going to behave. And I think the realization was you can have as many test environments as you want, but some things you don't learn until there's like actual value at stake. And then you like learn certain things like, and so I think the idea around Kusama was let's create, they call it a canary net, right? So let's create this environment. It's not the main net, but in a way it is its own main net in the sense that it has value, but it's the place where things get deployed first. So like anytime there's like an update to the protocol, there's obviously all of the testing and security, other things that happen, but then there's going to be a step where it gets deployed to the canary net. It soaks there for a while, right? So you leave it there and you understand then like, hey, is this going to work? Like, is it performing as expected? There's a real network with real like participants in and around it. They're being coordinated by the, by the token on it. And only once like something has proven itself for some amount of time as safe and sound and secure, then you would promote it and like move it up to your final destination. So that idea has always been the case that like we've been following that formula that Parity laid out. And so there's been a huge number of updates. I think there's been something like 20, 30 updates since the network's launched. But every time it's deployed first to Moonriver, it like soaks there, like it's observed, it's like people work with it, and then once there's comfort, then those features are moved like or that update is moved to Moonbeam. And so there's been a ton of learnings like that have come from this setup. There's been frankly there's been some problems, from issues. There was this whole expect chaos like meme that was around Kusama, so that definitely happened where some issue was encountered first on Kusama, but or on Moonriver. But as a result, then we were able to adapt, adjust, and then that issue like did not happen like when the Moonbeam deployment happened. And so I think I liken it to if you want the latest and greatest features and you want to get them first, then like, Moonriver is the place where they're going to land.
Yeah.
But, if you want like the environment that's more optimized for, stability, safety, security, then Moonbeam is like is the correct place. And we just continue to like, operate like in that way.
How long is it? So you launched Moonriver first on the Canary Net, and then how long does it normally, as you say, soak there for? Could you comment on that before it's transferred over to Moonbeam, or is it kind of arbitrary?
No, there is kind of like a bit of a cadence, and so and there are like governance like forum posts that kind of like help people get visibility into like, hey, here's what's upcoming, and obviously there's a voting process then from the community to like vote in like any given like set of features or upgrades. But yeah, so it's roughly like a 6-week process, like between updates. Let's say 6 to 8 weeks, something like this. And so within that 6 to 8 weeks, it would be like a month for each. So like, it would like live on like on Moonriver for, let's say like 3 to 4 weeks before being moved up. That's roughly what it looks like.
Yeah. Okay. That's good to know. Yeah. Final question is from a gentleman named Richie Me. And Richie asks, what is the direction you have for Moonriver? And is it any different to Moonbeam?
Yeah, I think it's similar to what I was just saying, where, while they are different networks and there's different stakeholders, so they could diverge. It definitely serves this like Canary Net use case best if they're relatively converged, because like we want like basically to be able to try things like in Moonriver first before that same update is like applied to like Moonbeam. And so that's kind of my hope, that it continues to be able to operate in that fashion. But right now, like once a release cycle is done, then they're like basically equivalent, like they're at the same level. But then Moonriver will step like ahead basically for some amount of time until like Moonbeam catches up. Like that's the model.
Okay. And that's pretty much all the questions I have for you today, Derek. I really appreciate you coming on. Do you have anything else you'd like to plug or mention in regards to any network or yourself before we close things off?
I guess we hit on a lot of great things. I mean, I would just say that like this whole connected contracts idea, this idea that like, these messages that connect different blockchains together, this is all new stuff. But like there is like a first wave of protocols that are going to be going live on Moonbeam in the first half that are using these technologies. So that's the thing that I'm quite excited by. So that's like the use case we talked about with XOut racers, or like Prime Protocols, another protocol that like is in the DeFi space that's using these techniques. And so that's the thing I would encourage folks to check out, like as those things come online.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Derek. I sincerely appreciate your time. I know you're a very busy man, and I think everyone should hopefully be a bit more aware of Moonbeam now and the potential it has in revolutionizing the space. Again, thank you so much. And guys, make sure you go follow Derek on his personal Twitter and also Moonbeam and Moonriver's. They're all on screen now. So thanks again, Derek, and we'll see you all soon.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you.